G'day guys, ZiggyD here in the Path of Exile Ascendancy Expansion Alpha Test, and today I want to show for you guys the upcoming new keystone to the expansion, Elemental Overload. This keystone is located in between the Witch and Templar section of the tree, just here, off the same branch as the Mental Rapidity and just above Mind Over Matter. This new keystone gives you 40% more elemental damage if you've critically struck an enemy in the past 8 seconds. Now most keystones have some form of drawback, and this is no exception. This removes all of your critical strike multiplier. So you lose all of your extra damage when you critically strike an enemy, but you gain 40% more damage for 8 seconds after getting a critical strike. Now this doesn't, just before we move on, this doesn't remove your ability to get crit related triggers, right? So that includes things like shock and freeze and ignite and of course cast on crit. Now you don't need to actually deal additional damage with a crit to ignite an enemy, for example, or to freeze them. You just need to get that critical strike in the first place. The effectiveness of the freeze or the shock or the ignite is based on the amount of damage you deal, and this will give you 40% more damage on that critical strike. However, you won't get that critical multiplier that would normally boost it quite a bit. So I've seen quite a bit of discussion on Elemental Overload, and it seems like most people's first impressions of this keystone have been pretty bad. And that kind of took me by surprise, especially having tested it quite a bit on the alpha now, because I feel like it's an insanely good buff to non-crit spellcasters in particular, and that it might have some applications for non-crit elemental attack based builds. What I don't think it has any applications for are really a critical strike focused builds, except for maybe some small circumstances like with cast on crit builds that aren't investing in much crit multiplier. There is certain breakpoints where Elemental Overload might be better for those styles of build. But for the most part, you're not going to use this in a crit build, and I think that's where some of the dislike of this keystone comes from, this idea that if you use this in a critical build, most of the time you're going to be losing damage because critical multiplier is better. You can get way more damage when you crit with critical strike multiplier. The real power of Elemental Overload, though, is the fact that you can get a big damage buff without really investing in crit all that much, or even at all in some cases, as I'm going to show you in this video just now. So, before we move on, to give you guys a bit of a better idea of my perspective, I'll show you guys what my character I'm currently running is playing with Elemental Overload, how it works in actual combat, so you can see the buff effect triggering and the effect that it has. So my unbuffed damage is 2,140, by the way. So we'll start fighting enemies, I'll drop my Orb of Storms, I'll Storm Call them to finish them off, and you can see this buff up in the top left, this shiny 3-colored one here, Elemental Overload. Now while that is up, my damage goes from 2,140 to 2,999, almost 3k there. So as you can see, it's a very, very significant damage buff, and it's a great damage buff for spellcaster leveling. It's a huge buff for spellcaster leveling. You end up with so much damage thanks to this. Now you'll see that as I fight through this zone, I have very, very good uptime on this buff. You can see it refreshing and staying around 8 seconds there, and you can see it being up for most of the time as I fight these monsters. And the damage buff is applying to my character the entire time that it's up just here. So I'm fighting my way through this zone effectively, and I can keep this running pack to pack, keep this up very, very effectively. Now you might be thinking, okay, so did you have to invest in some form of crit to achieve that? Well, not really. I have 6% crit on Orb of Storms, and 6% crit on Stormcall. 5% crit on Stormcall, no less. No, actually, only 5% crit on Stormcall. Now, why is that? Do I have Controlled Destruction? I've even got Controlled Destruction linked to Stormcall. So I actually have a reduced critical strike chance support gem linked to Stormcall. I have 0 crit investment in the tree, and no items with critical strike multiplier on them. And yet, I can maintain pretty close to 100% uptime with Elemental Overload as I'm clearing. It becomes pretty clear at this point how this is a very strong buff for non-crit spellcasters. You can get 40% more spell damage for the 1 to 2 passive nodes it takes for builds in this area of the tree to be able to get this keystone. That is a huge buff to non-crit spellcasters, right? So, I'm having a lot of fun with the power granted by this keystone, but I'm not gonna lie, I was actually a little disappointed when I learned how easy it was to maintain this, because when I saw this, I thought, hey, this is really cool. I like this idea that you have to think about how to efficiently get just enough crit to give this perma uptime on your build. So I started thinking about things like putting power charge on crit on my Orb of Storms, and I'm even getting the Ascendancy class Hierophant just here. One of the keystones from this, Conviction of Power, gives you 10% chance to gain a power charge on kill. I thought, hey, I can invest in maybe 1 or 2 power charges, or maybe just the 3 base power charges will be enough to get me to 10-15% crit chance, which will be enough for me to maintain 100% uptime on this. I was actually a little disappointed when I learned that I didn't actually have to do any of that. There was no real investment associated with getting this 40% extra elemental damage. So very powerful, very low investment. Now when it comes to elemental attack based builds, this is going to be a little different. So this is an important thing before I kind of move on to the general power and strength of this keystone currently, and maybe before we talk anything related to balance, I want to talk about elemental attack based builds. Now for spellcasters, you can get this, and as you've seen here, you can maintain this with 5 and 6% crit just fine, as long as you're some sort of build that casts reasonably quickly, right? Or has a good number of hits. Orb of Storms is fantastic at keeping this up because as you put it down, it keeps zapping enemies fairly consistently. Each one of those rolls separately on the crit strikes, and it will trigger often enough to keep it up. With this being 12 seconds duration, you can drop it on each new pack, it'll stay up, triggering elemental overload, and then your main spell will refresh it every now and then again as well. So it works perfectly. Slower casting skill builds might have to invest in a little bit of crit. So attack-based builds, however, they have a bit of a different problem. When you're playing an attack-based build, a non-crit elemental attack-based build, so something like an LE Cleaver or a Lightning Arrow elemental focused build, you'll be getting Resolute Technique typically. And that's because for the investment, that removes the need to invest in any sort of accuracy, which usually ends up being way more efficient and at a much bigger damage boost and a much bigger consistency boost for your character as well. So when you choose to go Elemental Overload on one of these builds instead, then you're committing to having to invest into accuracy and potentially crit if you're a slower attacking build. Now, Elemental builds are very typically faster attacking, so that's not usually an issue. So those will be the same in terms of spellcasters with the way this keystone currently is, in that they won't really need to invest in any crit, but they will need to invest in accuracy to make sure that they're able to deal their damage effectively, because if you're running around with 80% accuracy, then your damage is going to be garbage even with Elemental Overload. So you need to get Elemental Overload, and then you need to invest in some forms of efficient accuracy as much as possible. And there'll be breakpoints where it won't be worth getting this, and where it will be worth getting this. So as far as balance is concerned for elemental attack-based builds, I can see this being reasonably well balanced, right? There'll be some cases where builds can get efficient accuracy or maybe a bit of accuracy on gear, and this damage multiplier will be well worth it. And then there'll be cases where it's just better to go Resolute Technique, because that ends up being a big damage boost anyway. Maybe you end up even getting more tooltip DPS with Resolute Technique, let alone the build being more consistent. However, for fast casting spellcasters, I do think this is a little easy to maintain in its current state. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of leaving things for a league so that we can, we can experience them for a full league. We are in the alpha here though, and I think it's important to give my feedback on what I think is the true and honest state of things at the moment, even though I know a lot of people get really annoyed when I say something might be a little too strong. I also suggest some things might be a little too weak as well, just for the record. But I do think for non-crit spellcasters, zero investment whatsoever in anything crit related to be able to keep this 40% more crit, this 40% more elemental damage up all of the time is a little too easy. I think that you should have to invest at least several nodes in getting some form of crit, or at least have to use the increased critical strike gem on something like Orb of Storms, right? Or on your main skill potentially, to be able to get that trigger. I feel like there should be some little bit of investment there, and I was excited, as I said earlier, to be thinking of creative ways of doing that, right, that wouldn't detract from my main skill. I'm rocking this Hierophant helmet setup here, right, which is, I need to make sure that my gem selections are optimal. I don't want to be putting a less optimal gem in there like increased critical strike, so I'm thinking things like power charge on crit on my Orb of Storm, maybe I could run Assassin's Mark, maybe just the Hierophant node will be worth it, maybe those will be the ways that get me to trigger it. And I like that the game was forcing me to do that to get a very powerful buff, to put some investment and thought into creative ways to get a very powerful buff efficiently, I think is a very good thing for the game. Now, there is a bit of a problem here, and I don't know how ZiggyD are going to approach this, and I don't even know if they are going to make any changes to this. Maybe they just intend for Elemental Overload to be a very, very strong non-crit spellcaster buff. I mean, they could probably use it. Crit's had its time quite effectively, and crit still remains being very, very good. But, I think maybe this could do with just a little bit of investment. on our part in order to be able to keep it up. But as I said, this is going to be something difficult to balance, because if you do weaken this, like say bring it down to 4 seconds or 6 seconds or something like that, then it's not really going to affect these builds that much, but it will affect builds like elemental attack-based builds that, you know, have to invest in accuracy, or slower casting builds as well. So it's a difficult thing to build. I am indeed running like the optimal spell setup for this, something that will trigger very often. Something like Spark or something like Orb of Storms is going to be very effective at keeping this up, whereas some other builds won't be. So it would be a little bit of a tricky thing to balance, and maybe it doesn't need balancing. But I thought I'd talk about how I feel the state of it is now, and if nothing else, you guys can take away from this that if you're thinking about spellcasters in Ascendancy, then non-crit is more than a viable option, very strong. This brings like a consistent big damage boost to non-crit builds to bring them much closer in line with the damage potential of crit builds. Of course, crit builds at the higher ends of gear and investment are always going to top out in terms of damage, but this is a very nice way of bringing it back up in line a bit closer to where crit builds are. As just a final note, I will link in the description below this excellent table by Moribundus from Reddit, and this is crit and crit multiplier breakpoints for where Elemental Overload is effective and where it's not effective on crit builds. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it makes much sense to get Elemental Overload on crit builds, except for in some cases like Cast on Crit. And this table might be helpful for you guys if you're thinking of doing that, right? And just to reiterate on what the reason that is, because I see a lot of people kind of confused about this idea, but if you're getting 50% crit chance and then you're thinking, hey, I'm going to get Elemental Overload, then you, at that point, should just be dropping that 50% crit chance, right? Like, there's no reason to have that much crit chance because you're losing the crit multi. The primary reason for having that much crit chance, as long as you're not using something like Cast on Crit that needs that crit for some other form of trigger, as long as you have just enough to keep that up 100% of the time as you're fighting enemies, then that's all the crit you need, and that might be something like 5 or 10%. So guys, I hope you found this helpful and interesting. Very nice Keystone, very strong. Maybe something might need some balancing, but maybe not, if it is simply intended to be something that is bringing non-crit spellcasters much closer to crit spellcasters. So I'm pretty curious to hear what you guys think about the Elemental Overload Keystone and whether you'll be using it in the Ascendancy Expansion. Let me know in the comments below. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.